And welcome to Agency Acquisitions and Exits. I'm your host, Peter Lang. And today we have the privilege of welcoming Martin Lauber, a seasoned entrepreneur who successfully sold his agency to Dentsu, the fifth largest advertising network in the world. Martin's experience comes firsthand from navigating and traversing the acquisition process, making him a perfect resource for agency owners looking to sell or buy other agencies to grow. Let's dive into his remarkable exit journey and learn valuable insights from his time at Swirl. Martin, it's good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Great to see you.
We're going to be talking about your exit and the story behind that. Before we get to the end, can you start us off at the beginning? How did you even create Swirl, the agency, and what was your background? Help the person who's listening to this relate to you a bit.
Sure. Thank you for asking that. That's always a great question to understand the origin story. So I was a creative director at Foot Cone and Belding in San Francisco in the early 90s. And I had the good fortune of being a part of a group that was doing at the time what they called alternative media or new media. And that included CD-ROM projects or in-store for Levi's. It then became, we were the creative team on the very first iterations of Levi.com, L'Oreal.com, AT&T.com. So these were, and Levi's in particular, it was, I think it was one of, if not the first major brands with a web presence. And ours was very much kind of a zine, if people remember that term, you know, an e-magazine kind of format. So it wasn't necessarily selling jeans and apparel as much as promoting culture and exploring pop culture, and obviously consistent with the other strategies that Levi's was using. So that was where I got my start as a creative lead in that environment as a copywriter by background. I had come from Walt Disney Studios, where I was an in-house copywriter doing trailers and that sort of thing, and that was right out of college. So that group, our little group at Foot Cone and Belding, we kind of got, it was suggested to us that we go off and do our own thing, and that was the genesis of Swirl. And I partnered at the time with a colleague who had been running a major account lead at Foot Cone and Belding, but at the time was over at another independent agency, and then a third partner at the time who was a technical lead at RGA. So we kind of had the account management, we had the creative, and we had the technical, and our intention was to do nothing but, you know, alternative media type projects. We formed Swirl with the naive thought that Levi's was going to follow us with all of their amazing interactive business, and that did not come to pass for a number of reasons. So we had to quickly pivot, and Swirl became, you know, kind of a more broad offering, not just new media. But I think one of the very first projects we did was a direct mail project. But it was quite successful quite early, based on the momentum of the .com boom. And we had a lot of really wonderful .com clients. We had a lot of wonderful big clients as well. And so that's the origin story of Swirl. I ended up had a little bit of experience and exposure to M&A by actually bought out my two partners early on. One of them very early on, like within a year, and the other one a few years in. So that's the origin story of Swirl. 20 years later is what we're here to talk about. What happened 20 years later?
I mean, you have so many things in your journey that people can relate to, right? Starting a company with ambitious and energetic co-founders, right? Partners, yeah. Who you knew from the industry, and, you know, you're taking over the world. And then you add the flavor of, well, maybe it's not the right fit for them a few years in or after a period of time, or they want to go off and do something else. So you interacted with that. So it sounds like you had a lot of the real business conversations kind of early. When we spoke, you talked about how, the decades went on and there was a certain point where I don't want to say we're done. How about just you were at the point of, I'm ready for maybe my time in this industry to be over or to close the door on it. When did that kick in for you?
Well, there were two kicks, if you will. There was the personal kicking in for me. I mean, I started Swirl when I was 26 years old, and I may have peaked a little early. So I think, if you can imagine all the things that you don't do in your 20s and 30s, if you're building a business. So, you don't travel as much as other 20, 30-year-olds. You don't get married. You don't start a family. You don't do a lot of the things that I have been very fortunate to be able to do later in life. So there were personal reasons too, where I was kind of, after I'd say a good 10, 12 years, was kind of like, man, all right, I'm missing some other things. And then, but more importantly, honestly, for me, was that there were a lot of business reasons. And so if you'll appreciate the unique geography and time that we were in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, during the dot-com, growth and implosion. And so, I sat on the sidelines. I still feel very strongly that our firm, Swirl, and all the wonderful, talented people there, that we created just tens of millions of dollars in value. We helped create tens of millions of dollars in value for a lot of our clients. eBay, good example. And we were compensated for it. But it always bothered me that we were paid for the hours that we put in, not the value we created. And so the other kick in, kind of when I was done, was just this frustration that I was watching and spectating on this incredible business growth and dynamism that was happening around me in the venture capital world and the startup world. Again, based on the geography, we had a front row seat to all of that here in the Bay Area. But we weren't participating as a player. We were participating as a adjunct supporter of, and that was my fault. There's no reason I couldn't have proposed different compensation structures or invested. And so I started to do that a little bit, and that took my attention away from the pure agency business and more to, kind of an investor profile and point of view, which is what I, started to do then and what I continue to do now. And so that's what kind of moved me, my frame of mind to like, hey, I still want to be here. I still want to do this, but I want to do it in a slightly different context.
And that was the first one you were describing, but you hinted at two. So what was
the other kick? As I said, the other kick was the personal kick, right? Was just feeling like, the amount of time that it takes to operate a firm of the size that Swirl was, and the attention that it deserved, and the people there that deserved the attention. It meant I wasn't giving attention to other aspects of life. This isn't a personal podcast. I will share that.
Right.
I will. All right. I will share
let's
that,
get true, Martin. Like running a business
right.
and building. You described sacrificing your life for work for a significant period of time. And when people go to sell their business, it's a personal decision.
Yeah. I mean, my amazing partner in life, my wife Kelly, and I, we dated for a very long time before we got married, and that it had a lot to do with, how I was spending my time at Swirl, and just the lack of energy and emotional time I had once the day was over. I sound like an old man when I say what I'm about to say, but maybe for the benefit of your listeners, I used to go into the office every Sunday at 2 p.m. and I would stay in the office until 9 p.m. every Sunday. And that was the only way I felt that I could get ahead of the coming week. And so, and I loved it. It was quiet. Nobody asking me any questions. No, I could go in quietly, get it done, and then come to work Monday morning ready to go. But that if you imagine, a lot of things happen on Sundays. I remember one Sunday in particular, I got a phone call early in the morning asking if I would comment on the local news on the Super Bowl ads, because a friend of mine who normally did it, a copywriter who normally did it, was unavailable, and they needed someone to just do commentary on the Super Bowl ads for the local television affiliate. And not only could I not do it, but I wasn't even planning to watch the Super Bowl or be at a Super Bowl party. I was planning to be in my office like I usually was on a Sunday. So anyway, and it's just a dumb anecdote about, owning an agency, growing an agency, committed to an agency. It by definition, it means that there's other things that you are not doing. And for me, it got to a point where that was too big a sacrifice.
You ultimately sold in 2017.
Yes.
To Dentsu, and that was a long process. Take us through the setup, because like many, you were very involved in the business, potentially a bottleneck. It was your life. And there was a sequencing events to even get ready to go to market. And then there was this whole go to market and interacting with prospective buyers and then closing a deal. Run us through that journey that you experienced.
Yeah, I mean, we literally signed our deal with Dentsu, and specifically for the McGeary-Bowen agency brand within Dentsu in December of 2017. The dialogue with McGeary-Bowen and Dentsu probably started about just under a year before that. But the preparation to sell the agency and the kissing of frogs, if you will, started several years before that. And I would say it even started in 2011 when I actually recruited two gentlemen to come from different backgrounds to come and join Swirl as partners to create a management team. That was the particular strategy that I got some very good counsel to follow, which was, don't sell it yet, build it. And to build it, you need to bring in a management team. And so I was very fortunate. One of my existing employees, and in fact, the very first employee, agreed to become a partner. And so she was elevated within the business and was quite capable. And then she and I recruited two others from the outside world, one of whom had been the president of a large agency network, and the other was a senior executive at a international talent agency running branded entertainment. And so I'm not sure how we attracted those two guys, because we were a fairly good sized agency, but still compared to where they came from. But I think it had to do with ownership. They were high paid executives, but they didn't own anything, and so this was an opportunity. And they joined us in roughly 2010, 2011, 2012, over that period, staggered. And with that, we had our management team in place. We elevated some more people internally to a leadership team, and then grew Swirl to prepare it to be sold. And those conversations then happened with other potential acquirers in earnest, I would say, in 2015. And we had a whole series of cycles with some of the other usual suspects, and the big holding companies, Dentsu's counterparts and peers in that category. For one reason or another, those things didn't happen, and then we ended up again in serious discussions and eventually an exclusive arrangement with Dentsu.
It would be helpful to shed some light on those manager hires, right, and the partners in that 2010, 2011 time period. Were you clear that they were coming on board as part of an exit strategy? Was that known to them day one? How did you get the company aware that, you were at this stage where you were looking for options here for the company to go to the next level and for you to get an exit?
Yeah, we were very deliberate, very, very deliberate about that. In fact, the advice to build a management team in order to sell the company came from my longtime mentor and attorney, and that's his specialty was the representation of marketing agencies and the sale of those agencies. And so his name is John Anderson. And he literally, I remember the lunch I had with him where I said, I think it's time to sell this thing. And he said, oh, no, you are 5 years away from selling this thing. And he knew, he knew. And of course, that's not what you wanted to hear. But he then explained it. He said, you got to recruit some leaders. You got to build a consistent process. You got to, and that's what we set out to do. And ironically, or interestingly, I met him that day to say, God, I'm done. And it wasn't, it was many years later. It was even more than 5 years later that we actually sold. But what it did is it rejuvenated me because I had a plan and I had peers and colleagues, and being deliberate about it, even to the staff. There's some, one of the dynamics at our firm was that Swirl grew very quickly. And so you had a lot of people who, while they weren't owners of the agency, they certainly owned their own career trajectories. And what they wanted was for Swirl to grow, for Swirl to become part of an international agency network, for opportunities to exist for them professionally. And so it's often, I think it's an oversimplified narrative to say, oh, well, the founder sold and he or she made a bunch of money. But there really are, it can, if done right, it can create career opportunities for the leaders. And I mean, I don't just mean the leadership, I mean the leaders at a given agency, the people who are bright and ambitious and interested, because all of a sudden you go from being at a firm where there's the limitations are the four walls of that building, literally and metaphorically, to being a part of, you're an office in an international network. And if you are good at what you do, which all our people were, and if you're ambitious in the right way, which many of our people were, then there are opportunities internationally and nationally for, not to mention bigger clients and more exposure and all the things different people want in their career. So, sorry, we set out to be very intentional about recruiting those managers, those partners. And they knew in those discussions, those recruiting discussions, that that's what they were being recruited for, to help facilitate the sale of the firm.
That's reassuring for a lot of owners, right? Who sometimes feel selfish when they start getting towards the end for them, right? When you sat down with your friend and attorney and I'm like, I'm done. How do I get out of this thing? And a lot of owners that we speak to keep the really challenging bits of this very private, right? They're not opening up to their team and saying, I've put blood, sweat, and years into this business. I'm ready for the next opportunity for all of you. And you are 100% right. The people that you employ, the team around you, get a whole new opportunity by being a part of a company that's experiencing an exit or doing acquisitions. It's just career experience that is hopefully valued by each individual. You got this team in place. You got your managers. It's 5 years after you were, quote, done. What led to Dentsu being the deal you closed on? What did that look like? The interactions of what you can tell us, and from the courting with Dentsu and other parties to close, run us through the steps as much as you feel comfortable or can share.
Yeah, I mean, it's rather provincial, the answer to your question, and that is it was relationship. It was one of the partners I recruited in particular Tom had a really good relationship with one of the partners at McGeary Bowen. I don't remember which one, but their relationship became kind of the lightning rod for doing this deal. So much so that, and again, I don't remember everybody's name and all the cadence of all this, but literally the guy running McGeary Bowen left, like right at the goal line, so to speak, and went to go run the agency we'd been talking to before we were talking Dentsu. So
it's a small world, right?
Yes,
well,
it is.
yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's the same 15 people switching chairs over and over again. But the strength of the chemistry that had been built, which I take no credit for, and I'll explain why in a moment. It was the strength of the chemistry that kept us in the dialogue with McGeary Bowen and Dentsu in particular. I say I take no credit for because I missed more dinners and drinks than I ever made, than I ever attended, and that's where a lot of that chemistry happened, in those lunches and those meals and those kinds of things. But the partners that I had brought on did put in that time, did do that work, and were able to solidify that relationship with McGeary Bowen. And also, your question, getting back to it, was why Dentsu. It made sense. I mean, they were an agency brand in ascension. They did not have necessarily a digital capability or a significant West Coast footprint. And there were a couple of clients that were shared, client brands that were shared. And so strategically, it made a lot of sense. And then the chemistry was both the foundation for that strategic opportunity, as well as the constant glue that kept bringing it back together every time something changed, along the course of that almost year-long dialogue, like a major executive leaving and going elsewhere on their side.
A year-long dialogue.
Roughly. I think it was about 10 months.
10 months. Did it feel like 10 months of negotiation and due diligence? What did that 10 months feel like when you were in it?
It felt like 10 months of waiting, to be honest. There wasn't a lot of back and forth negotiating terms. There certainly was some of that, but that wasn't the prevailing feeling. There were intense moments of that where they would send the LOI. We'd take, the obligatory 2 weeks to respond, acting like we weren't that eager. And then we'd respond and red lines and so on and so forth. And the law firms, were doing most of that. But those were intense but limited moments. I mean, I'm not going to try to downplay it. There were times when the four of us were standing around one of our computer waiting for that email and then reading it over each other's shoulder to see. Yeah, I mean, that, I'm not embarrassed to admit that.
It's exciting.
Did they agree? Kind of thing. And so there was a lot of that. And then there was a lot of printing out of these 27-page LOIs and reading them at home and talking to your spouse and your roommate or whatever it was. And so there was a lot of that. Sorry, not roommates. That's not allowed under just non-disclosures, but wives and husbands or partners are. But most of it was just felt like a lot of time. And really, what I remember most distinctly is talking my fellow partners off the ledge over and over again, saying, one of them in particular is just they're all good people, but this guy in particular is just a lovely human being. He's just a wonderful person, but he's got a short fuse sometimes. And his pet peeve is people dragging their feet. And by definition, this was a lot of feet dragging. Yeah. And so he would want to fire off these emails basically saying, look, either put up or shut up. And I'd be like, all right, go ahead and write that. Now delete it, So there was a lot of time of just, and I think the mistake you're not asking me this question, but I'll offer this advice. The mistake that a lot of business owners make during that downtime is to take their eye off the business, because most of it is waiting. Most of it is, you'd like to think that the acquisition of your firm is the single most important thing in the world to Dentsu. And I'm sure we were one of many, many, many transactions. And for all I know, we were a transaction that was given to some junior analyst and said, here, look, I don't know. All I know is all the things we thought were making it take so long probably had nothing to do with it. And taking it personally is one of the most anti-productive things that you can do. And so I do remember spending a lot of time telling my partners, like, look, just don't worry about it. Like, just forget, like, act like, you don't care, and the email will come, the response will come, and we'll deal with it when it comes. To this day, I still use the phrase, don't borrow trouble. And one of my partners, who's still a very dear friend, she hates it when I say that, drives her nuts when I say that, because I used to say it in that particular context. I don't know where I got that Zen attitude from. It wasn't from years and years of experience. I just realized there was really nothing we could do about it. And trying to wreck them was only, I don't think that was going to help.
A lot of deals ultimately are hurry up and wait because of, especially when dealing with strategic buyers, there's a lot of moving parts. And as you mentioned, you're not the only deal they're paying attention to. They've probably already closed another acquisition, doing multiple integrations. You highlighted something that I think we should double tap on, that letter of intent, and your stoic disposition towards it. Let's compartmentalize the stoicism for a moment and say, give us the real emotions, the letter of intent, getting them, seeing the number that they were presenting to you, reviewing it, unpack that for the owner who hasn't experienced this before. Like, how exciting was it? And then when you signed it, what did that feel like?
So it's very exciting, and I don't know what the various laws are in certain places where people are sitting right now listening to this, but in California, if you want to have a food label on the back of a package, you have to put the calorie count in bold letters right at the top. And so you turn over any package of anything and you know exactly how many calories it is. You don't have to look at anything else and jump. I wish LOIs had the number at the top, because the real human answer to your question is, you get this LOI and you just start scanning. You're just scanning all this other stuff, and it doesn't mean anything to you until you come to like some number. And I don't care what anybody tells you, that's what we all did and do, and it's okay. I wish they just put the number at the top. Start with the number, and then explain all the ways you're actually not going to get that, right at the front, whatever. But anyway, so that's a very human reaction to those LOIs. Then there was the degree to which each of us personally had what we were looking for, right? And that may be a dynamic that some of the business owners that you encounter will find, where, like, for instance, one partner, it's all about, the upfront payment. Maybe another partner, it's about what are their personal career opportunities in a post-acquisition version of that company. For me, it was very, the financial remuneration was critical, but right next to that, like immediately after that, and in the end, more important to me was my time. Like, what would I be able to do with my time? Because as we went over, the genesis of this was me for wanting to go do different things. And so, whereas the other three partners, things in the LOI, like their own compensation and different things, mine was, how am I restricted? That was really, or not restricted. That was really what was critical to me. So there was that next layer. Once you see the number, then, okay, everybody starts reading the same letter for individual reasons, in our case. And then you asked about the signing of it. If I remember correctly, the thing that the one term that we always wanted to argue about with the buyer was the length of the exclusivity. And, because that's a big, it's you're committing contractually to not have discussions with anybody else. And the challenge with that is that because it's such a small world, as you pointed out earlier, the minute you're in discussions with a potential acquirer, everybody's interested. And yet there's this exclusivity thing, which makes perfect sense. It's a very valid business term that everyone should have to abide by. So that was always like, well, 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, we naively thought, well, if we can't get this done in 30 days, then they shouldn't have the right to buy. We should be able to talk to whoever we want. So I remember that, ironically, being the one term that we always argued about amongst ourselves, and then of course with the buyer. And then it's again, I'm sharing some of my own personal ignorance at the time. If I remember correctly, the LOI itself was many pages. And so when you think about it, that's just an outline of what will be a contract. So it felt like a contract in and of itself. So it was interesting to realize, man, this isn't even the beginning. This is the pre-beginning of what's coming if this comes to fruition. So signing it, yeah, it was important. And we had to go through the gestation period of realizing, hey, this is a non-binding document. So as much as like, don't get used to these numbers, don't get used to these terms. This is what everyone's indicating they're interested in doing and willing to do. And in some respects, it changed quite dramatically in one or two instances later. So there was that learning curve for us that just because we were signing a very significant, in terms of number of pages, document, didn't mean that this was the agreement. It meant that it was the parameters of an agreement. And for a lot of us as business owners, we assume, all right, once we signed it, it's it. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit on that term, but
it's very important, right? When you look at price and terms, right? You talked about fixating on the number, right? And I don't know if we're going to get that number from you today, but just for the audience to know, it's a very important number, especially when you have other partners. And what you get in an LOI oftentimes is not the number you end up with. So maybe without going into too much detail, give us the deal structure composition. So obviously it was some cash on close. There was an earnout, because that's traditional within service businesses in general to mitigate future risk of uncertainty. Was there any rollover equity? And then you talked about what you'd be doing, or the non-compete aspect was really important to you because you were leaving, you were done. So what were some of the compositions of the LOI? How did that ultimately change, if you can share, to purchase agreement? Maybe not specifically, but kind of in parameters. And then how did that play out overall versus your expectations?
Well, the LOI, the terms were very traditional. I think as you've alluded to, a certain percentage of valuation at closing. The number that I'm referring to that we were looking for was total potential deal value number. And ours was in excess of $100 million. And I don't care who you are, it's like you hear the phrase in excess of $100 million, and it's an excitable moment, right? So we went into this, even me, knowing that I was going to leave. We all went into it knowing that Swirl had a lot more to offer and a lot more growth ahead of it. And so the total deal value potential was a real thing to us. And so that's the number that we were focused on. Very soon thereafter, you kind of understand how many things can go wrong, right? And so then you start to focus on, okay, what is the cash up front number? The term that changed for us dramatically from the LOI to the actual purchase agreement, really the body of terms focused, it didn't affect me dramatically, but it focused around the employment construct of the partners that stayed. And it without going into details, it really revolved around the notion that the LOI indicated a certain level of employment and a certain focus of employment. And in the end, it became much broader than that. And in fact, one of those partners ended up going to run a different company that was owned by the same acquirer. So it was a very personal and professional difference for those individuals. It ended up having a major impact on Swirl itself too, but that's another story.
That's not too far off from my next question. Before I get there, though, you've signed the LOI. There's a lot of hurry up and wait. And you're finally getting to a potential stage of, we're going to close this deal. Share with us, what did the closing of this deal, signing the purchase agreement, releasing the signatures, how did you feel? Was it relief? Was it excitement? Was it reloading the bank account? Like what did that feel like for you? And where is that in one of the, most memorable periods of your life?
So it was, I remember it all very well. We were in the conference room of a very, very large, very capable law firm, way high up in the sky and the skyscraper in San Francisco. I mentioned that because they had to call me back to the conference room because I was looking at the view. I was like so impressed by where we were. And I remember that I was already gone. I was so focused on things I was going to do personally and professionally that I was underappreciating the moment. And I can give you a very personal example of that. One of the partners, and like I said, he's a beautiful human being, and I appreciate him to this day. He brought us all pens, beautiful. I don't know if they were Mont Blanc pens, or I think they were actually beautiful pens. And we each had our own pen. And the whole idea was it's a keepsake and you're signing this thing. And I remember, I don't think I actually signed it. I just grabbed a pen that was in this little plastic holder. And I actually feel badly about that now because he took the time to go and buy these pens and think about each of us and make it a moment. And I just flubbed it off like I wasn't pretending to be disinterested. I was just focused. I was gone, already. And I wish I had been more present. But we all signed, and it was. I remember after that it was a bit anticlimactic because it wasn't like we got on a conference call with our new owners and everybody. It went off. The lawyer, some junior lawyer took it and went off into the other room, and everything got scanned. And and then yes, I think. I don't mind admitting I remember the day, a few days later, we checked the bank balance and there it is, and so, yeah, I don't know if that, but it was a moment, it was one of those, movie scene moments where we're all in a big fancy conference room, which was much nicer than any conference room we ever had as our own agency, doing the official signing of the document. So, yeah.
You get cash on close and there's an earnout in the actual purchase agreement. And so you described the number that you paid attention was the total available to you, essentially. What is the purchase price going to be? And that included the entirety of the deal structure. So you got the cash on close. It was over 100 million potential value. And then you had this earnout. So the earnout is tied to integration. I'm assuming Swirl continued to grow from the 2012 ultimately to the year you sold it. What did it look like now that you were being assimilated by the big machine that is a holding company? And if you can share, what was the impact on the earnout and you ultimately?
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, if we did everything, if everything went 100% according to plan, the potential deal value was north of $100 million. So if we hit every goal, if we hit every integration challenge, if we, revenue growth, everything was so. And we, back at the LOI stage, which is when you asked the question about, at that point in time, we were full of vim and vigor, and we could do this, right? Many months later, when you actually sign the paperwork, you got used to the idea that, all right, so if we achieve half of that, we'll be, that kind of thing. So you start to adjust it. So that's just to clarify that. Your question about what was it like to be with them, the big machine? There's two caveats to my answer. One is, as I've said several times, I had checked out. So I was not in any way really operating the business during that initial integration and those early days of being a part of the Dentsu group. So I'm probably not the best person to actually answer what was it like. But I can share an answer based on the constant contact I had with my partners and other employees of the company, what it was like after that. And a lot of it, and this is where no amount of documentation or planning can prepare a particular transaction and its integration post signing for human nature. And we just got a little unlucky, and some of the important people important to our deal on the Dentsu side left. And there were some major leadership changes on that end. And some people who joined who had no vested interest in our deal. In fact, one of the new leaders at McGarry-Bowen, the very first time I met him, one of the very first things he said to me was, had I been there, I would not have done this deal with you.
Warm embrace. So
yeah,
lovely.
yes, exactly. Yeah, he didn't say it in a jerky way. I mean, I was a little taken aback, but I think that was his objective. And by the way, wonderful guy. I'm having coffee with him in a couple of days. Real super nice guy. Like I respect his directness. But so it just is a real extreme example of how things that have nothing to do with your firm can change, right? So all of a sudden, our champion was gone. The new guard isn't necessarily glad that he's inherited this deal and this new firm. So that was one dynamic that was challenging. Another was that, again, part of the objective, I think, on Dentsu's part of acquiring Swirl was a digital capability for McGarry-Bowen. So because that was their objective, part of their objective, they then took some of the key employees of Swirl who were critical to that capability and started to introduce them to their client base around the world. And this was commonly referred to as the roadshow. And it's exactly what I would do if I just bought something and I wanted my customers to know, hey, we just acquired this wonderful firm and these great people, and let me introduce you to them. That's the positive side of what they did. The downside was that it took those people off of key projects. And Swirl, despite its size at the time of the acquisition, which was mid-size, good-sized firm, it was still run in a very personal way. So even the most senior people on an account were very critical to projects at the project level with clients like Microsoft and others. And so when those people were absent at key meetings, or even just absent in the building when the client was there for a meeting that this person wasn't even supposed to be in, but they weren't there to say hello because they were in London or Stockholm or Berlin or whatever, or Chicago, it started to have a negative effect on some of the relationship with Swirl's clients. And so these are common. I don't think these are unique dynamics to us and our deal. And I want to be very clear. I don't fault Dentsu for doing it. They had a plan and they were executing on their plan. I think the integration, I think we all could have handled the integration better, and kept our eye on the ball a little better. And that includes myself. I stepped away too much, too fast. So that was a little bit of anecdotes about the post transaction world in the first 6 to 12 months.
And that's very common. Just for context, how big was Swirl in headcount when the deal closed, roughly?
Roughly, it was just north of 300 employees.
And then when you started really integrating into Dentsu, those 300 was fitting into a network that was, much more vast, more supportive. You talked about, that's going to hurt clients. Was there any communications that you were aware of that clients were unhappy with the company being acquired, or was it, what kind of feedback were you getting from the personnel and the clients?
Well, so I think from the personnel, by and large, I think people were supportive of it because, again, we were this scrappy little agency that always knew that we were better than we got credit for being. We were, the joke is, people referred to it as Squirrel instead of Swirl. And while I may regret it naming it that back in 1997, we still took pride in who we were. And so in some respects, the acquisition by McGarry Bowen Dentsu was validation of what a lot of us felt. And so I think by and large, people were supportive and happy about it. Not to mention the career opportunities that it created for a lot of people. There's always going to be people, ideally few, but there'll always be people who grumble and complain about, even some of the owner. Some of us complained and grumbled, about
you signed the agreement and you're still going to complain and grumble about it, right? That's
exactly.
Natural.
So I think that's something that again, unsolicited advice to agency owners that are getting ready to sell is, if you're trying to make if you think everyone's going to love it, you're not dealing in reality. And what's important is to hear people out and to understand what their concerns are and to acknowledge them and to address their concerns where you can. And the things you don't know, you can't tell someone exactly what it's going to be like under new ownership. So don't pretend that you can. I think the best we did was to promise people an open door, which they'd always had once that transaction happened. But so, and I think from a client standpoint, we always ran the agency and maybe overly so in a very personal way. So our clients were our friends. And to this day, that is true. And so we had a lot of support. We had, the direct contact clients were very supportive. And in some cases, again, going back to what McGarry Bowen's objective was, the clients were really thrilled up and down because, hey, this is an agency we're already working with. This is an agency we're already working with. Now they're the same company. So that made life easier in a lot of ways for the client as well. So by and large, there weren't initially, or even before it was signed, when it was common knowledge that it was going to happen, there weren't complaints or concerns. There's always the client who liked to kind of say, hey, I better still be able to call you when after this and that kind of thing. And they certainly did and were able to do that. But no, there was no, and even many, many months into it, there was never a time when a particular client called and said, all right, I'm gone. This isn't working for me. It was kind of, more like death by 1,000 cuts, it was, as opposed to some seminal moment, some showdown.
You had shared previously that it was not the Martin show. You closed the deal and they left you alone.
Yeah.
Maybe we can revisit that briefly. Right? What?
Sure.
Because you shared that was good originally, and then you got some sage advice from your partner. So what was that?
Yeah, and this is something again that agency owners in whatever scale will have to deal with, and that is there's so much driving you for an exit. They even call it an exit, which by definition means you are leaving, right? You are, and then all of a sudden to be like, well, wow, the phone's not ringing. Emails aren't coming in. Clearly, this isn't, I wasn't as critical as I thought I was. So you go through all the versions of that. And that was, in my particular case, I was adamant about the least amount of post-transaction restriction as possible. And I think for tax and other reasons, I was literally an employee, a W-2 employee for 1 year, exactly 1 year. And I was asked to participate as an employee exactly 0 times during that 1 year. And like I said, in the beginning, it's like, wow, I'm getting paid to do nothing. And then it was like, oh, I'm doing nothing, And then it was like, oh, why aren't they asking me to do something? And so, I'm speaking from a very personal perspective, right? They gave me exactly what I wanted, so I'm not complaining. I'm more kind of sharing if there's a theme here, in my case, it's that this is a business transaction that is heavily influenced by personal feelings. And so, it's an example of where I was kind of dealing with some of that. So,
yeah. And then
the
advice from your partner was, wait, you can go and do other things then. If
It was like, his advice, the summary was basically like, you're kind of looking at this the wrong way. He had to go to all these meetings that I wasn't being called into. And so he's like, you know what, consider yourself lucky. So yeah, there was that. And I once I kind of worked it all through my ego, I was fine about it, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Well, let's bookend Swirl chapter. So you had this $100 million potential value if you checked all the boxes, had every milestone. Was it as successful as your expectations, or did it fall short?
From an economic standpoint, no, it was not. It was not as successful as everyone's expectations. I want to be clear. I think the folks at McGarry Bowen and Dentsu also hoped for a very different outcome. I think they would have been happy to make the kinds of earnout payments that were indicated by the deal, because it would have meant growth, right? So no, economically it did not turn out. Personally, as far as, which again, I said, to me, they're interwoven. It's been very good. I've been able to start a life in an adjacent career and stay in touch with all the people that want to stay in touch with me and that I want to stay in touch with. But I think that the integration of the firms could have been handled better. I think that the opportunities for growth were not capitalized on, on both ends. So yeah, I don't want to say I regret it, because I don't operate that way. But I think that both parties left opportunity. There was potential untapped. Let's put it that way. Not individually. I think a lot of the people have gone on to do amazing things and great things, and I'm lucky to be a part of some of that since then. But in terms of firms, actual companies, I candidly, I don't even know the disposition of McGarry Bowen at this point in time. I hope it's thriving and doing great, but I don't know. And from what I understand, Swirl doesn't exist as a brand. And so, unlike a lot of founders who probably have interwoven their legacy, if you will, I don't feel that way. I got out of Swirl everything I'd hoped to: lifelong friendships, amazing lessons, remuneration, and so I don't, I'm not, it doesn't hurt my feelings that, we don't still have a big office in San Francisco and all that stuff. Life goes on, business goes on.
And this is a good transition into what you do with 19 York, right? Your extended relationships, the network you developed over the years, and then what I find very fascinating, you now partner with companies that kind of sound like you when you started, coming from somewhere big and wanting to go out on their own and change the world. So share with us what you're doing now, maybe how it started, just so people have context, and why you're doing it. Because you could have been out of this industry,
yeah.
Martin, and yet they reeled you back in.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. So, yeah, I along with a small team, operate 19 York, and we are an investing and strategic partner in a number of boutique-sized marketing service firms and marketing automation software platforms. So, we literally make minority-sized cash investments into these firms, and then by networking them together and helping to professionalize their back office, we help them grow. So that's what I do. So if you got a small agency and looking for a potential investor partner, look us up. The genesis, though, of 19 York was related to a topic of your podcast here, and that is that during those years when it was obvious that we wanted to sell Swirl, obvious to those that were kind of paying attention to that, a few of our key employees came and sat down and said, hey, kind of clear, the writing's on the wall, what's happening here, and that's not for us. So we're going to leave and we're going to start our own thing. And this is them talking to me personally, and saying, hey, we didn't want to leave in such a way where we're sneaking out the back door with some of your office supplies. Like, we wanted you to know what we're doing, and we appreciate what you did for us, and so on and so forth. And I think they expected me to be upset and I was envious. I mean, I was like, wow, that, like, all those feelings that when I was 26 years old and getting started, started to come back. And
so much for listening to this episode of Agency Acquisitions and Exits. Thank you to Martin for joining us today and sharing his exit journey. Give us a follow on YouTube and Spotify to get notified when we publish new episodes. And you can connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn. If you know anyone who would get value from this episode, we ask, please just share that with them. And if someone could have a story similar to Martin or similar to our guests about this exit journey, this M&A process, please send us an email. We'd love to have them. As always, stay safe and thank you.